Madam Speaker, in 2018, so about 5 years ago, the House was seized with a very emotive and very serious issue, and that was the transfer of Terry Lynn McClintock, a child killer, from a maximum security prison to a much less secure facility. It was a healing lodge. And I remember the debate in the House, and I remember reading the stories of how the families of the victim were re-traumatized through this decision. So that was 5 years ago. And before the summer constituency break, Madam Speaker, 5 years later, we had a very similar debate in the House, and that was when it was revealed that mass murderer, mass child killer, Paul Bernardo, had been transferred from a maximum security prison to a less secure facility. And I mean, 5 years passed. I don't understand why the government didn't make changes to ensure that this type of re-victimization of families and the most serious crimes happened again. How did it happen again? In fact, the former minister, Ralph Goodale, who was overseeing the McClintock file, he failed upwards into an ambassadorial position. And in fact, the Liberals in 2018 actually amended the criminal code so that it would require that inmates are held in the, quote, least restrictive environment possible. So it's been 5 years. I just, out of respect for victims and families, I think that I would like to see some unanimity in this place that two things. The government acknowledges that this is not appropriate. I would like the government to say that mass murderers, I would like to hear this from the member who's responding to this question, mass murderers should stay in maximum security prisons. One, that they agree with that prison, or that principle. Two, very importantly, that the government agree to rescind that amendment that they made in former Bill C-83, and that least restrictive environment should not apply to mass murderers and child killers like Paul Bernardo, like Terry Lynn McClintock. The other thing that I would like the member who's going to reply to this question to agree to, so that this doesn't happen again, so that we're not having this discussion and re-victimizing families again, is whether or not the Prime Minister has agreed to issue a directive to require all mass murderers to remain in maximum security for their entire sentence. This should be a principle that every person in this House agrees to, and it is the government's job. The government has the responsibility and the capacity to do this. The buck stops with them. So those three things. I'd like to hear mass murderers should remain in maximum security prisons for the duration of their sentence, that the government will repeal the least restrictive environment provision that they put forward and passed, and also that they will issue a directive to require all mass murderers to remain in maximum security for the entirety of their sentence, so that we don't have another family of a child killer or a mass murderer and this re-victimized. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I do appreciate having the opportunity to rise tonight to speak about this incredibly important issue. And I thank the member from Calgary Nose Hill for bringing it forward. The discussion around the re-victimization of families and loved ones who have been impacted by crime is incredibly serious and something our government takes incredibly seriously. I remember the debate of both instances that the member opposite referred to. It's incredibly painful. It's painful not only for the victims' families and loved ones, but all Canadians who have, saw those dark times or those crimes really have impacts on so many people across this country. And that's precisely why, Madam Speaker, we made changes to ensure that people who commit these heinous crimes pay their sentences, reflect that, and they are not out to commit crimes again. So, Madam Speaker, the decisions to reclassify and transfer offenders, which is specifically to the question here today, are taken independently by the Correctional Services of Canada, or known as the CSC. And the CSC's mandate is to help maintain safety and security of our communities by managing the correctional institutions of offenders and their care. It is important to acknowledge that these operational decisions are not taken by elected officials. Our jobs as members of this House is to continue to push for best practices, like my colleague has mentioned, and it is to increase transparency in our criminal justice system. But that's why earlier this summer our government issued new ministerial directives to establish additional information and sharing procedures in cases involving high-profile offenders. The new directive instructs that, quote, prior to transferring high-profile offender to any reduced security level, the Commissioner of CSC or their delegate will notify the Minister of Public Safety formally and directly, end quote. Additional efforts will be taken to ensure that CSC takes a trauma-informed approach that considers victims in these cases of the transfers and security classifications. This can be facilitated, for example, by providing registered victims with the opportunity to share uploaded victim statements for consideration during security classification and transfer decision-making processes. What this means, Madam Speaker, is enhanced engagement opportunities for victims to share important input throughout the offender's sentence. It means that the needs of victims and their families will be taken into account, and that CSC will place extra emphasis on the needs to not re-traumatize those who are most vulnerable. Madam Speaker, again, I've mentioned that while elected officials don't make the operational decisions, it's important for us as legislators and for the public at large to know why these decisions are made. And to that end, the Commissioner of Correctional Services has shown her willingness to listen to Canadians' concerns over these additional reviews of high-profile cases when needed. And these reviews undertaken by committees with external representatives. Madam Speaker, we take this incredibly serious and want to ensure that victims are at the forefront of these decisions. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Calgary Nose Hill.
Do you notice that there's a common theme among Liberal responses? And it's after 8 years of them being in government, they say it's not our job. And that's what the member opposite is saying here. The reality is the buck stops with government. The government writes and Parliament writes the directives and rules under which these decisions are made. And after 5 years since Terry Lynn McClintock, now the families of Paul Bernardo's victims were re-victimized because the government put forward legislation to put mass murderers in the least restrictive environment and also refused to issue a directive to ensure that mass murderers stay in maximum security prisons. So, Madam Speaker, I'll ask again. Does the member opposite agree? Can she just say that she agrees that mass murderers should stay in maximum security prisons and that the provisions around least restrictive environment as it applies to mass murderers and child killers that they put forward and voted on in Bill C-83 be repealed?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, what I will say and what I will reiterate once again is offenders of these violent and heinous crimes absolutely deserve these severe consequences. I will just point out, because I think we want to take this subject incredibly seriously, and as legislators we need to be responsible, and I do just want to point out that some of the information being shared is not actually correct, and in fact that member sat around the cabinet table when these same directives existed. But what we've done, Madam Speaker, is we've actually changed them to ensure that victims are at the forefront. So, Madam Speaker, the member opposite raised fair criticisms. Unfortunately, they were criticisms for her government as well, but we take the matter incredibly seriously, and that's precisely why the minister ordered new directives to put families at the forefront, victims, loved ones at the forefront, and to ensure that the re-traumatization of these heinous crimes are not done once again.
become